On September 17th, Netflix released one of its most popular, if not its most popular series to date, Squid Game, directed, created, and written by Hwang Dong-hyuk. The show itself is a psychological thriller that works to critique capitalism in South Korea. The show's protagonist, Song Gi-hun, was a car factory worker who went on strike with his fellow workers, only for the police to come and brutally murder his best friend right in front of him. Afterwards, he tried opening his own business, but that too failed and led him to take on a tremendous amount of debt from banks and loan sharks, who now want his head, and his eye and kidney too. The only way out of Gi-hoon's personal hell and hell for so many others is to enter another dire situation by participating and surviving 6 rounds of games with 456 contestants, where the lone winner will walk away with 4.56 billion won, as each player's life is worth 100 million won. The show itself is really interesting and has a lot of themes we're going to unpack later, as well as answer the question, where's all this money coming from? But before we do that, let me establish a pattern. The pattern I want to explore is that many of the non-English Netflix series and films that get a large international audience tend to be about class and critique capitalism, and later, with you, I want to try to explore why that is. Most recently, there's South Korea's Squid Game, but there's also Brazil's 3%, Spain's La Casa de Papel and El Hoyo, France's Lupin, Mexico's Roma, and going back to South Korea, Bong Joon-ho's Palme d'Or winner Okja from 2017, which has parts in both Korean and English. And even before Netflix, non-English movies about class struggle around the world tend to appeal to a wide number of audience goers, as well as win prestigious international film awards and the very local US-centric Oscar awards. One of Brazil's most internationally recognized films of the 21st century, 2002's Cidade de Deus, which illustrates the extremes people go to in order to survive in a corrupt capitalistic society and how poverty is impossible to escape, won the BAFTA for Best Editing, the British Independent Film Award for Best International Independent Film, the Satellite Award for Best International Motion Picture, and was nominated for 4 Academy Awards. In 2018, Roma, Alfonso Cuarón's black and white masterpiece which focuses on class and racial hierarchy in Mexico City, focusing on an indigenous housekeeper Cleo, portrayed by Yalitza Aparicio, was tied with The Favorite as the most nominated film that year at the Oscars. And in 2020, Parasite, directed by Bong Joon-ho, a film that focuses on classism in South Korea, won not only the Palme d'Or, but the Best Picture at the very English-centric and local Oscars. And that's not even including the English-produced juggernaut Slumdog Millionaire, which focused on class but in a more hopeful way than, say, Squid Game or Cidade de Deus, but used Indian actors and an Indian setting in order to appeal to the majority white English-speaking Academy, and which walked away with 8 Oscars, none going to the actors. And before we move on, I know that the Oscars aren't necessarily that important compared to more international and more prestigious film awards, but you can't deny that having a nomination gives a significant boost to a film. Ira Kolb, a professor of marketing at the University of Southern California's Marshall School of Business, has done research into how big the Oscar payoff could be for a victorious film or for even a nominated film. The nomination, and especially a win, keeps the movies in theaters longer, boosting box office receipts, and it substantially increases DVD streaming, download, and cable TV revenues. For their research, they focused on The King's Speech. Before being nominated, it was expected to make about $30 million in worldwide box office receipts. After it received 12 nominations that year, the most of any film in contention, that estimate was revised upward to $200 million. Not to mention that the Oscars have marketed themselves in such a way that they make themselves matter. Around the world, most people who are more casual moviegoers might not know what a Golden Bear is, for instance, but they understand what an Oscar means. Hollywood holds a significant amount of soft power and influence globally, and that should not be underestimated. So when a non-English film gets recognized by the US Film Academy, who has a chokehold on most mainstream media, it's kind of a big deal. Especially since English is seen as the most quote-unquote universal language due to a long history of imperialism and colonization, it's awesome when non-English and non-US productions get recognized and get that Oscar boost to help them reach people around the world who may not have checked out a Portuguese, a Spanish, or a Korean language film. It's especially cool to see because due to the ridiculous hierarchy of languages where English has been placed at the top due to the US's soft and hard power techniques, East Asian languages are sometimes seen as the most foreign, so it's nice that they're finally being given a chance. And it's also great how Squid Game and Parasite both comment on the global hierarchy of how the US has pushed itself to the top and has in turn torn families apart because of that. And though getting praise at the Academy Awards, for example, gave a boost to Roma and Parasite and led more people to pursue watching non-English media, it also sometimes leads to a kind of dissonance and tokenization. So there's a whole Reddit thread of celebrities and wealthy people just not getting Parasite. Like, really, Elon, Parasite is your favorite film? Not to mention that many have commented on the Academy awarding Parasite for diversity points, rather than because they actually understood the film. This can best be seen by the lack of acting nominations, which isn't surprising considering the general lack of Asian and Asian American acting awards at the Oscars, let alone nominations and awards for Asian actors not speaking in English. In addition, films like The City of God and Slumdog Millionaire have been critiqued for being quote-unquote poverty porn, to be consumed by white audiences and, in the end, the white film elite, who vote on the best pictures of the year. Though City of God does comment on race and class, it was adapted from Paulo Lean's book of the same name by white film duo Fernando Meirelles and Katia Lungi. And after the film premiered, many of the black actors didn't reach the same heights of success as some of the white actors in the film, and some even became impoverished. Emmy V. Bill, who grew up in Cidade de Deus, said in 2005, "The film brought no good to the favela, no social, moral, or human benefit." And that can sometimes be the fallout of films about class and non-English speaking people who are viewed as quote-unquote other and quote-unquote less than by the white film elite, especially since the majority cast of Cidade de Deus were black. And for some who live outside of Rio's favelas, it can be hard to not watch the film without taking part in a sort of schadenfreude, of at least I'm not them, or at least I don't live there. It can also lead to this overgeneralizing sentiment that Brazil is just this dangerous, crime-filled, impoverished, quote-unquote shithole country, and that people who live there are equally as bad. But it's important to note that this overgeneralizing effect, whether it comes to how people view Brazil or any other non-English speaking country and its media, is that it's more of the fault of the US, that again has a chokehold on mainstream international media. Whether it be through traditional Hollywood or US-owned streaming platforms like Amazon, Netflix, HBO, Disney+, etc., it's extremely difficult for non-English media to reach the same fame as English media, but it is definitely possible, and when it happens, it should be rightfully celebrated, even though the owners of said platforms are still US-owned multi-billion-dollar companies. So now that we've set the groundwork of how significant it is when a non-English, non-US production becomes internationally known and some of the fallout that comes from that, now let's move on to why, and more specifically, why most of these films and series are usually about class struggle and capitalism. The first reason I already actually touched upon a few minutes back, and that is the shock factor that talking about class and capitalism allows. Think about the more disturbing scenes from City of God or Squid Game, for example, that make it so they're impossible to ignore. There's just an inherent horribleness of how terribly poor people around the world live and are treated that leads to more interest from people who want to know what life is like for others around the world, and for some who just want to gawk at the misfortune of others. Like I said before, this can lead to an unfortunate exotification and othering of the subjects of the film, rather than an understanding. But more recently, I think that's been changing, and some films and series have called out the US and their domination of the world outright. In addition to just the shock factor of people living in extreme poverty that has helped magazines like National Geographic sell for decades, there's also usually fantastical elements that add to the already imposing visuals of the setting of the film or series that leads to more viewership. Not to mention that because there's such an emphasis on aesthetics and more avant-garde costumes, makeup, or sets, the producers make it harder for you to look away and forget about what you're seeing. The next reason why I think a lot of non-English media that tends to get a more international following is about class is because this type of story usually leads to the protagonists being automatically sympathetic or at least understandable to a global audience. Audiences love underdog stories and stories with more ambiguous protagonists as well, which class critique also lends itself well to. Not to mention that a lot of these do-or-die scenarios make one wonder, what would I do if I were them? What choices would I make? And therefore the media becomes interactive and weaves its way into one's mind the way most psychological thrillers do. Lastly, class is a global issue that is fairly understandable to people all around the world, unlike race and gender issues which tend to be extremely complex depending where you are in the world. Class is something that's just more easily understood. It's easy to understand the difference between having a million of something versus none of something, between having a big house and a small house, and therefore stories about class are simply more universally understood by more people. Of course, there's nuances in any movie about class that specifically pertain to the region where it originates, which we're gonna get into. But there's a reason why these movies and shows are as big as they are, and it's because they're able to be easily understood, at least on some level, and that's important. So now that we've generally listed the reasons why non-English media tends to reach more people and become more popular when it's about class and capitalism, now let's unpack the principal reasons one by one. Like I already mentioned, the initial shock factor that draws people into media about class comes from just the inherent premise of following a group of people in dire circumstances who live in awful conditions, and that tends to fascinate a lot of people and also make the characters automatically sympathetic and relatable. But besides just the horrid living conditions of the setting and characters, there's also usually an obscene amount of death and violence when it comes to these movies and shows about class, which in turn gives them higher stakes, which then makes the story feel larger and more important. Whether it be The Hunger Games, Squid Game, La Casa de Papel, El Hoyo, or Parasite, a series or film tends to do better on a global scale when there's some sort of high-stakes violence going on, and stories about class lends itself well to that. Besides blood and gore, there's also the more artistic and fantastical elements that make for more compelling and more memorable cinema for many people. But it's important to note that the media's more unrealistic elements are then used to tell real truths about ourselves and the specific societies where the movie or film takes place. Parasite and Squid Game are the most extreme examples, using the absurdity of the Kim semi-basement apartment that is based in reality, but pushing that limit so even the toilet is above them. Or using the very real reality of mounting household debt in South Korea, leading to Gunsi living in a bomb shelter for the rest of his life in order to not get killed by loan sharks. Squid Game's shock factor comes in with the games, of course, and the easy-to-understand visual of not only people being killed, but how the piggy bank fills up as the number of players go down. But Squid Game also has unique commentary about South Korea. For example, Gi-hoon's very specific backstory of being a motor factory worker and how that ties into the organizers of the 2009 Ssangyong motor plant strike. Squid Game's global popularity, however, lies in the aesthetics of the easily memeable doll, the Escher staircase, the jumpsuits, and the circle, square, and triangle motif that needs no words to explain what they mean. These images work to engage viewers who might not usually watch Korean language media, but who are so compelled by not only the premise, but the visuals that they choose to sit and watch a 9-hour series. El Hoyo, or The Hole in English, is probably the most gruesome of these examples in that it includes cannibalism. The premise is that the main character, Goring, decides to take part in an experiment for 6 months to get a diploma, only to discover that the experiment is, for a lack of a better word, hell. In a tower-like facility, he waits with another inmate for the platform, their only source of food for the entire month. There are over 300 levels, and the lower your level is, the less likely you're going to get your share, as those at the top eat more than they need to, leaving the bottom with nothing. The catch is that every month they're assigned to a new level. Sometimes they're at the top, sometimes they're at the bottom, and one month Goring decides to try to get everyone to cooperate and take only what's necessary. In the end, they send one untouched piece of food back to the top to show that everyone's only eaten their fair share. But to the chefs above, who apparently know nothing of this experiment, they see this quote-unquote message as an insult to their cooking. Just the visual of the tower, the platform, and the hole works so well and so brilliantly that of course it ended up being one of the most watched films on Netflix, specifically during the first wave of the pandemic. La Casa de Papel, or Money Heist in English, is one of the top Netflix shows about a group of people who decide to rob the Bank of Spain and who later break into the National Mint. The iconic costume of the Dali mask with the red jumpsuits sparked so many people's interest that it is now on its 5th and final part when it was originally just going to be a 2-part series. The show is definitely out there and revels in its violence and morally ambiguous characters, and also uses its fantastical elements of young people playing Robin Hood to comment on the rise of youth employment in Spain and the economic hardships young people in Spain face. Lastly, Lupin, though based in the very harsh realities of racism, classism, and xenophobia that is specific to the Senegalese immigrant experience in France, still uses its own over-the-top set pieces, high-end technology, and magic in order to generate views from outside of France and French-speaking countries. And though a lot of the symbolism and settings are used in these pieces of media to both convey unique regional problems when it comes to class, a lot of the symbols are also again universally understood, specifically the theme of upstairs, downstairs, and high and low. Seeing the Kims in their semi-basement, or even worse, Moon-gwang and Gun-si in the bomb shelter and the Parks living above them, is something reminiscent of H.G. Wells' The Time Machine, and his critique that the lower classes have become pushed underground while the rich take over the surface world. This motif can also be seen in El Hoyo, also known as the hole or the platform, where the literal lower levels die off or become cavemen-looking non-human creatures, as opposed to those at the top levels filling their bellies. The upstairs, downstairs, and high and low dichotomy is perfectly illustrated in the descent of the Kims fleeing the Park's house during the flood, as they descend lower and lower until they're completely underwater, drowning in literal shit. The height visual is also of course seen in Squid Game, where if you fall and end up on the ground, you die in both Tug of War and the Glass Game. And of course, with how Oh Il-nam is in his high-rise looking down at the poor below him. One character type I think most people enjoy watching is that of the underdog, the character that has been beat down time and time again only to rise up. But in more recent years, we've deconstructed the underdog and have made them more ambiguous, thus creating interesting tensions when it comes to stories in general, but especially those about class. Gi-hoon in Squid Game is of course the underdog. We want him to be reunited with his daughter and save his mom, but know that he can only do those things through terrible means, killing everyone around him. Thus, Squid Game comments on how capitalism pits the lower classes against each other, much like Parasite did, but of course also focuses on the VIPs who fund the games out of sheer boredom. And though Gi-hoon ultimately chooses not to kill Sang-woo, all of the other players' blood is still on his hands, which is why he can't bring himself to spend the money that came at the cost of hundreds of lives. In the end, however, he's still portrayed as a good guy and a hero we can root for, and decides to go up against the VIPs to end the games once and for all. I know a lot of people were angry that he didn't go find his daughter, but I personally like the ending of him heading off to get revenge. Sang-woo is a more ambiguous character than Gi-hoon, and though by the end is just kind of purely evil, ends his own life so Gi-hoon can live, trying to make up for all of his previous evil deeds. Does it work? I'm not sure, but I really liked Sang-woo's character and how he always had an angle, and I thought his character explored evil really well, but let me know what you thought down below. The characters in La Casa de Papel are also painted as heroic, but a lot of their quote-unquote goodness is still really ambiguous. I personally hate how they continue to make Berlin into a good guy to be remembered, but that's just me. When it comes to Lupin, he's of course a straight-up good guy and underdog which we love, and so is Goring from El Hoyo, who many have compared to Jesus or a Messiah who entered the experiment just to get a degree. In Parasite, the Kims aren't perfect people, and in fact they're pretty mean considering they get people fired from their jobs through questionable means, but they only do so because they see it as their only way out from their life in poverty. Their children can't afford an education, and the jobs they can do, like folding pizza boxes, have no meaning to them, and pay extremely little. So instead, they scheme their way into the Parks' house to try to get a taste of how the other half lives, only to still be oppressed. The work they do isn't necessarily demeaning, but the way they're treated is. Mr. Park hates workers who, quote-unquote, toe the line. Mrs. Park uses Ki-tek as a human shopping cart, much like how the VIPs in Squid Game use humans as furniture. Not to mention the way the Parks turn up their noses around Ki-tek because of his supposed smell. They barely see the Kims as people, and this is ironically highlighted in the newscast at the end where the anchor says that Mr. Kim and Mr. Park were friends. When Ki-tek or Ki-jung don't want to do what the Parks say, the Parks respond, "You're getting paid extra," as if money can solve all of their problems. This echoes the Squid Game scene where Ga-young's stepdad gives Gi-hoon money to try to make him leave their lives forever. For wealthy people like the Parks or Ga-young's stepdad, they're so used to using money to have their way and leeching off the backs of the poor that they don't see the lower classes as people with feelings and needs and desires, but just as problems to get rid of. I know there's a small group of people out there who think Parasite villainized the poor, but in my opinion that's missing the point of the film. The poor shouldn't have to be perfect victims to be helped or understood. The Kims deserve to live and have money and live like the Parks with everything they need and want. And in the end, Parasite has a sad and bleak ending, with the Kims not getting revenge like Lupin, those in La Casa de Papel, or Gi-hoon, but going back to exactly how they started. Squid Game, La Casa de Papel, and Lupin, like I mentioned, have more optimistic endings, with Gi-hoon going back to the games, the Casa de Papel gang evading capture time and time again, though Part 5 has yet to come out, and Lupin saving his son and exposing the white rich bastards who ruined his and his father's life. The rich so often get passes for being evil because of this myth that they've earned their position, or that we all earned our lot in life, when that's not true. In fact, the harsh reality is that you're born into a certain class, and that is where you're likely going to stay. And that's a truth that La Casa de Papel, Lupin, Parasite, and even Squid Game show us. Though, like I said before, a lot of the imagery in these series and metaphors tend to be region-specific, they also tend to have wider global implications that people can latch onto, which makes these series and films specifically resonate internationally. This is also because, like we've discussed, these images are attached to a global issue, class, something most people on Earth understand, and that more and more people are becoming critical of. This media tears down this idea that hard work helps you quote-unquote get ahead, or that studying makes you smart, or that rich people got where they are because they deserve it. More and more people are realizing that the rich didn't get to where they are because they worked harder or studied more, but because they've had a head start. They've been afforded privileges and have used those privileges to continue to mold the world to their liking. And La Casa de Papel, Lupin, Squid Game, and Parasite shine a light on all of these issues, as well as their regional issues and histories. In La Casa de Papel, they break into the Bank of Spain in order to get the money they knew they never could make just by quote-unquote studying hard. In Lupin, Diop has to save himself and his family legacy alone, knowing that the corrupt justice system will only fail him. In Squid Game, all of the players aren't quote-unquote good people, but again, they don't need to be perfect victims to have our sympathy. Not only do they sign the consent form not knowing that they're going to be fighting to the death, but we as the audience understand that they wouldn't be here unless they really needed to be, and thus we see how capitalism tears people apart, and we see the desperation of the masses exploited by the rich. Sang-woo is again an interesting character as he's seemingly smart and has made his fortune legally, but it soon comes out that he's a corrupt businessman. You'd think that Sang-woo would be the most morally upright because of his degree and seemingly calm demeanor, but in fact he's one of the most ruthless characters in the show. Is he there to show us how capitalism turns us into unfeeling creatures who don't care about stepping on people to get ahead? Or is he there to show us that no one is safe when we live in a world consumed by greed? You be the judge. In Parasite, we learn that it doesn't matter how the Parks got their fortune, rather just that they're complicit in their roles and that they could care less about anyone who isn't them, and in the end, that's all we need to know. So now that we've answered the thesis of this video about why shows about class and capitalism, specifically non-English shows about class and capitalism, get big international audiences, now I think it's time to ask, do people get it? Do we get it? And go back to the first part of this video. A lot of people who watch Parasite, for instance, may not get it, either because they see the Kims as being the parasites who deserve what they get, or because they're so stuck up their own ass they don't see a critique of the wealthy when staring them dead in the face. In addition, there's been this ongoing critique of how the rich, much like the rich in Squid Game, have so much money they don't know what to do with it, so instead they decide to cosplay as being poor, either pretending to be poor or quote-unquote regular people on Hollywood tours, or getting a big yellow school bus for their kid just because they can, not to mention showing off their excessive closets. And though I think the super wealthy don't get these critiques and may just nod to them in award season because of diversity or because they think they get it, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. The people who this media is for are regular, everyday people, not necessarily as a call to action, but as a way for us to rethink society and perhaps imagine a place where classes didn't exist and where money didn't exist, a world where people like the Parks or the VIPs couldn't exist. What concerns me more than people missing the point is actually, do we take pleasure in the games? Do we, as let's say regular people who aren't millionaires or billionaires and who are just living paycheck to paycheck with no health insurance and student loan debt, do we, like the VIPs, take pleasure in the games of watching what will happen next and seeing who will win? Though of course it's a very different experience due to the fact that the games in our world are just a TV show and not real, I wonder if that says something about us. Like when people watch the Hunger Games as movies and have fun watching them, rather than feeling deeply disturbed about a bunch of kids killing each other. Does that take away from the meaning of the work? Can we have fun while consuming something that's supposed to teach us about how terrible we are to each other? And in the end, I don't know. I think I'm just scared of how fast we are to commercialize things like Squid Game due to the weird marketing of the Hunger Games. And before we wrap up this section and this video entirely, I want to talk about what sets Squid Game and Parasite apart from its contemporaries, and that is that they make intentional commentary on how US imperialism has perpetuated capitalism and the global hierarchy of not only the proliferation of English, but of seeing the US as the so-called, quote-unquote, best country in the world. There are great scenes in Parasite where the Kims trick the Parks simply by name-dropping Illinois State University in Chicago. There are nods to how the Parks drive a Mercedes and what that means, not to mention the company where Mr. Park works has an English name. In Squid Game, the US is critiqued for breaking families apart. Gi-hoon's daughter is being taken away from him by a rich man who's relocating to the US. The North and South Korean War tore Se-byuk's family apart, and we all know the U.S.'s hand in that war and the continuation of their involvement. The U.S. has shaped South Korea into its image, and that's something that cannot be lost while watching the series, and it's a huge message of the series as a whole. As Shin Kim wrote, South Korea's very creation was staked on it becoming an ally of capitalism and the U.S. through its incorporation into the global market. But that doesn't mean that Squid Game shies away from South Korea's own shortcomings and xenophobia either, as seen with fan favorite Ali, a Pakistani migrant worker who has no other choice but to play the games in order to try to get money for his family after his employer tricked him into not paying him for months. In the end, I think we're still trying to find out what Squid Game really means and what a lot of these series and films about class means, but in the end, it's not too hard to parse out. Though these films aren't necessarily a call to action, they are undoubtedly about the failings of capitalism and class inequality, both when it comes to their specific regions and internationally. And they're able to be so popular not only because class struggle is a global issue, but due to their stunning visuals and costumes and memorable sets that demand to be recognized, and their ambiguous characters and scenarios that we put ourselves in and sometimes aren't too off base from our own reality. I hope in the future we only see more non-English series and films being lauded and given the attention they deserve. Hi everyone, thank you so much for watching. I know that this is a kind of different video than what I usually do, but I hope you enjoyed it. And if you did, please give it a like, comment what you thought about Squid Game, and yeah, I'll see you all in the next one. Thank you so much to my patrons and members. Thank you so much for watching again. Bye.